So I wrote this entire video. I recorded a reading of the script, and then I edited it out, and I hated it. I realized I was doing something that I didn't want to do with the video, which was replace reading the actual books that I'm pulling a lot of this information from. So I started from scratch. This shit took a lot longer than it was supposed to. I do apologize for that. I'm still figuring this stuff out. With that being said, on to the video. You know how subtle Gears of War is, with its chainsaw bayonets and over-the-top violent executions where we beat people to death with their own arms? Yeah, not very subtle at all, obviously. So unsubtle, in fact, that it even has its own version of the oil wars, specifically an analog to the 1980s Iraq-Iran conflict, the Gulf War in the 90s, the Iraq War from the aughts, and a little bit of the Cold War thrown in there because the UAR is just the USSR but green. Friendly reminder that Gears of War came out in 2006, 3 years into the US's invasion of Iraq, and it was always critical of armed conflict. If you don't like politics in your video games, especially shooters from the Bush era, you are bitch made, and I truly do not know what to tell you. For what it's worth, I did plan on making this video before the United States government decided that repeating 2003 was the correct way to start the new year, but now I get to pretend to be topical, kind of. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about the Pendulum Wars, the conflict that took place right before the Locust invasion of the surface of Serra, who's involved, why they're fighting, and some significant events from the conflict. So, the Pendulum Wars, let's start off with the major players. You have the Coalition of Ordered Governments, which include the countries of Tyrus, Kashkir, some of the southern islands like Galangi and Aroma, Pisang, and various other locations that are either unexplored or not notable enough for me to remember their names. And Gears are the standard infantry soldier of the COG. On the other side, you have the UAR, the Union of Independent Republics. Countries involved are Austria, Goraznia, Pelis, and Vaskar, kind of, among some others. Indies are the shorthand for their standard infantry in the Tyran language. It might be a slur. I don't know. Now, I know I just listed off a bunch of meaningless names. Once again, we have no official map of Serra, so I can't really describe where those countries are located, or their strategic values, mostly. The big players that we hear about most often are Tyrus, the home of the COG, Kashkir, which is India, kind of, Goraznia, which is Romania/Bulgaria, and then Austria, or more specifically Asphalt Point in Austria, and then Vaskar, which is a neutral technological powerhouse until the UAR invaded and took control. Most of these locations will get more direct elaboration on a different video, but if it's relevant to this video's topic, I'll make sure to bring it up. So the conflict started 79 years before Emergence Day, 79 BE, and then lasted until 6 weeks before E-Day. We don't have a calendar for what the period before E-Day would be considered, because that's not how they keep track of time anymore. A lot of culture was lost in the Locust War, a lot of science was lost in the Locust War, so we just don't know what happened beforehand. It was primarily a conflict over the control of emulsion, which I've talked about in previous videos, but it's a miracle fuel, glowy yellow miracle fuel that just does everything, is incredibly efficient, but is very volatile. There were some concerns about freedoms playing out, as it was also an ideological conflict, but that was either a byproduct of the original conflict or propaganda. The US lied to its troops about why they were getting killed and scarred in the Middle East. It's not that hard to believe that COG would do the same. One of the earliest events of the Pendulum Wars that we know about was the construction of Azura. At one point, concern over the survival of the human race through the Pendulum Wars was incredibly relevant to the COG. The Hammer of Dawn was the most powerful weapon of mass destruction to be used, but it was not the first. Chemical and biological weapons were deployed often, and huge swathes of the planet were rendered uninhabitable for decades. In what would become a pattern for the COG, a secret facility was built. This one's purpose was to safeguard the most important people of the COG. Scientists, artists, musicians, politicians, etc. Rich lizard people who were already sheltered from the war went to live on Azura. One of which was our pal Dr. Niles Sampson. He would eventually be called away from Azura to work at another secret facility for the COG called New Hope, and then eventually an even secreter facility under Mount Kadar. I detailed the events of those two locations in the previous Gears of Lore video. Click somewhere on the screen to check that out if you're curious, or don't. I'm not a cop. Do what you want. But Azura is incredibly important to the events of the game, so I won't go into too much detail about what went down after E-Day, but it's mostly Prescott fuckery and lies at the cost of other people's safety. Later in the war, around 17 BE, the introduction of the King Raven, the COG's iconic armored helicopters, occurred. I've mentioned it before, but the majority of warfare up until the very end of the Pendulum Wars was almost exclusively land-based. The Navy was pretty much neglected up until right after the sinking of Jacinto in 14 AE, and there was zero emphasis on any kind of an air force. The closest the COG would get was the King Raven. Now, let me just read you a quote that I find to be very fucking funny. I can't do accents. The backbone of military aviation will always be rotary, and tactical air power must remain in the hands of ground commanders. Fixed wing costs too much to do too little. I see no reason to waste any more taxpayers' money on the Petrel Strike Fighter program, when we can spend that on helicopter launch missile systems. These birds represent better value and can do everything we need, and do it better in most cases: transport, combat, observation, maritime, and special missions. We do not need to fragment our defense strategy by creating a separate air force. The man who gave that speech was General John Lombard. He gave this speech to a COG defense committee in an attempt to convince them that spending money on a separate air force and building planes to replace King Ravens would be a waste. 2 years later, he accepted a position on the board of the company that manufactured the King Raven. Art really does imitate life. The same year, though, the first siege of Anvil Gate would occur, at least the first one that we know of anyway, since the city had been attacked numerous times over the centuries that it existed and had never actually fallen. But the first siege took place in the same year, and defined Colonel Victor Hoffman's career well into the Swarm War. But that's post-Locust War lore and not important right now. The city of Anvigad sat in the mountainous border between Kashgar and Vazgar, and was not really the most important target at the time, given Vazgar's reluctance to even get involved in the Pendulum Wars in the first place. Big emphasis on was. The Vazgar Prime Minister shit the bed so hard that they stepped down ahead of a vote of no confidence, drastically destabilizing the country as it was on the brink of being involved in a global war. The UIR would send in peacekeepers to help stabilize the region during this time of constitutional unrest. Haven't heard that one before. In an attempt to make the UIR occupation tougher on said peacekeepers, the COG sent a company of gears led by Captain Adam Phoenix to commandeer and or sabotage some of the infrastructure built to supply Vazgar's citizens with emulsion. Yes, that is Marcus's dad. Fun fact: emulsion companies were not informed of this ahead of time in order to avoid a potential security concern, something that the current glorious leader of the free world did not do in our reality. Adam's mission cut off Anvil Gate's piped-in emulsion supply, but it could still be supplied by convoy through a nearby mountain pass. The UIR, knowing this, set up explosive charges way before invading Vazgar, and detonated them, collapsing an entire fucking mountain over the pass, cutting off the city from resupply entirely. The CO in charge would get blown up by an RPG on day 2 or 3, destroying the command center, leaving Hoffman as the highest-ranking officer by default. Over the next several weeks, the UAR would bomb the ever-loving shit out of Anvigad, while it bled supplies and men. Too many injuries to keep track of, everybody starving, sleep barely coming as the shelling was near constant. It was hell. A fort city had gone from being kinda important as a trade hub that nobody expected to see conflict, to the front lines of the Pendulum Wars in a handful of days. It was genuinely fucked. So Hoffman was left with two choices: surrender and let the civilians go unharmed, or slowly bleed out and starve to death. Now, if you've ever played Gears of War 3, you know that Hoffman said that he wouldn't let the city fall in the last war, and he'd be damned if he'd let it fall in this one. So he clearly wasn't defeated, and Anvil Gate never fell. So how exactly did he get out of the shitstorm? Utilizing a couple recent additions to the COG military that the UIR intelligence didn't know about, Basenga Commandos, Hoffman faked a surrender. The civvies would leave, getting them out of harm's way, and he would let the Indy forces into Anvil Gate. Then once inside, he'd blow the remaining explosives and fuel they had left, and use the Basang troops to pick off the rest from ambush positions all around the city. If you played Gears of War 3, you know that this sounds incredibly familiar. Obviously things didn't go as smoothly as Hoffman would have liked, but the specifics are the third Karen Travis novel, which I highly recommend. The gist is that it was a successful but ultimately pointless gambit, as the COG reinforcements would have arrived in extremely large numbers if Hoffman had just waited a few hours to make that decision. The story, the official one, of Anvil Gate is that it never fell, but to Hoffman, faking a surrender was always a cowardly and underhanded tactic that he would be ashamed of for the rest of his life. Once again, I am asking you to read some of the books if you're interested in this stuff. I don't want these videos to substitute for an actual reading, so I'm intentionally simplifying and leaving details out. They are on Audible and read by Nan McNamara, who voices Anya in the games. I promise they are good. The UAR invaded Aroma Island in 4 BE, massacring an entire village in the process. It doesn't seem like there's ever an official reason given for their invasion. Best guess is that it was a good location to stage attacks on COG territory from, but given how the Navy was an afterthought to everybody, I don't see the value there beyond maybe like controlling supply routes. But then again, the UAR had actual submarines that were sturdy enough to survive well into the Locust Wars, so what the fuck do I know? Regardless, it was a failed invasion anyway, because Ty Kaliso was the only surviving member of the village they destroyed, and he was pretty much indestructible, running around in nothing but a loincloth, ambushing fully armored Indies with just a bow and a knife. Eventually the COG showed up, and Ty ran into Marcus. Marcus convinced Ty to join the COG so he could be on the winning side of the Pendulum Wars, and the rest is history. The Battle of Asphalt Fields was probably the most important event of the Pendulum Wars that we know about, and pretty much everybody that's a named character was involved. At least the ones that were enlisted at the time. Baird enlisted on E-Day and Cole did 3 days later, but Marcus, Dom, Hoffman, Bernie were all on ASFO, and Anya was in the CIC control room. Oh, and Paddock was on the other side of the battle, funnily enough, well, he kind of was. He wrote a report that detailed how Asphalt Point could have been taken by the COG and suggested some increased security measures be installed. Either nobody listened to him, or they weren't enough to stop the COG's assault in the facility, though. Anyway, it was the battle over. COG intelligence indicated that the UAR was on track to make a superweapon, and this would turn out to be the Hammer of Dawn. Now, with the UAR already having a major head start on even the concept of orbital weapons alone, the COG were desperate, not just to win the war, but to avoid total annihilation. Thus, the plan to capture this technology themselves, Operation Leveler, was born. The facility that had the UAR R&D was on an Austrian peninsula called Asphalt Point. The COG planned to stage a fake invasion of the Austrian Republic through a city that's name doesn't matter, in order to move troops away from Asphalt. Then the 26th Royal Tier Infantry would engage with the remaining troops from Pellis in the swamp nearby, to prevent them from reinforcing the facility, which was under attack by a group of commandos led by the then Major Victor Hoffman. Dom was one of Hoffman's commandos, while Marcus and Dom's biological brother, Carlos, were Gears and 26 RTI. Bernie was a sergeant at the time, commanding Marcus and Carlos's company, and Anya's mother, Major Helena Stroud, was leading the other half of the op. Everything started out as expected. Hoffman's commandos, which included a handful of Pasang volunteers that he met back at Anvil Gate, made their approach and broke into the facility without much effort. It took care of a few guards and found the scientists they had been tasked with kidnapping to prevent the UAR from starting the Hammer project again. They found the data they needed to as well, but then discovered a backup had been made and was stored at a nearby UAR army base. But that really wasn't that big of a deal. They radioed control and had the base leveled by bombers. No problems. There were some extraction complications, but everybody named made it out. Dom risked his life to save some fellow commandos and civvies, whose extract vehicle got shot all to hell, and the Pasang volunteers got killed saving Dom. Now on the other side, things were great, until the UAR rolled up with a whole lot more armor than expected. To summarize the latter half of the first Karen Travis novel, Major Stroud took down a tank herself, but blew up in the process, and Anya was on comms for all of it. Bernie almost had to mercy kill Carlos, because he got injured in a very inconvenient spot, and then died for a very not good reason. But that's disrespectful, so I won't elaborate. And Marcus ended up saving the day, because he's a fucking hero. Everybody involved got some kind of medal. Marcus's actions led to him becoming a legend among the recruits, and Hoffman got his last promotion that he would ever get. The chairman at the time, Dalyell, didn't give any of the Pasang troops any recognition, as they weren't real COG citizens, so Hoffman told the guy to fuck off in front of the media. Dalyell was not happy, and they railroaded his career, which, to be honest with you, Hoffman was fine with. He would have preferred to remain an NCO and, like, been in the shit with his men more often than not, so the only reason he made it this far was because he felt a responsibility to lead from the front. But what's more important is that the COG stole the plans for the Hammer of Dawn, and as a result were able to force a UAR surrender. They did this by blowing up a bunch of ships offshore from Bamberg, an Ostrini city that the COG were occupying. I don't know about you, but if I saw that my enemy had managed to successfully launch and fire an orbital laser platform, I would immediately surrender whatever conflict I was involved in. The UAR leader, Premier Yuri Dachenko, did just that. There isn't really much else to the Pendulum Wars beyond a small Groznian rebellion at a Visgari satellite launching facility led by Paddock, but the specifics of that don't really matter until Gears 5, to be honest. All that's significant is that it was put down by a light mass missile fired from Azura, which is how Paddock knew about the light mass's existence in Gears of War Judgment. That's pretty much it. Like, Asphalt Fields was like the last big moment. Obviously, Bamberg, where the demonstration of the Hammer of Dawn first showed up, was like super important, but the rest of it is not something that we hear too much about because it's, you know, political surrenders and whatnot. Like, there's the Groznian Rebellion, like I said, but that's not all that important until later, which I will go into, but not needed for right now. 6 weeks later, the Locust invaded the surface. You know, like, things are already kind of fucked, and they just kept getting worse over time. So that's basically everything that you need to know about the Pendulum Wars if you just want to get a surface level bird's eye view of it. I am once again recommending that you read some Gears of War novels. They're not half bad. The Audible versions are also pretty good. If you're interested in this universe, check them out. Like I said, I don't want my videos to be a substitution for reading those, so if you want more specific details, read those books. They're quite good. With that being said, that's gonna do it for me today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.